Okay, video 2. Okay, what we're looking at today is we're going to try and use React hooks to manage our Ethereum dapps connections and state. So this is a theme we'll use for the rest of the series. The idea is that with hooks, which is relatively new to React, you can have dependencies using something called useEffect. And those dependencies then can handle very complex state changes in your application very elegantly. So this is a theme we're going to use going forward. So to get some background on that, you may want to read this article here. And I'd highly recommend Dan Ambranov's Overreacted, especially this article, Complete Guide to useEffect. Since we're using it, it takes a little bit to get your head around it, but this article is pretty amazing in doing that. And he's got a couple more about hooks. If you read them all, you should be good to go. So the main thing we're using to get our blockchain connection to Ethereum, our Web3, is MetaMask. So MetaMask gets plugged into your browser. It then has your accounts that you're connected to. And you can do a bunch of things with this. Actually, we'll talk a bit about plugins as well, which is a new technology, the Snaps plugins. So what you want to do to start with is we're going to go to this directory, this URL, and then you're going to clone this repository and then open it up in your editor. And you can see we're using, for today, just for demonstrative purposes, just in case you need it, we're going to use Web3. Going forward, we'll use ethers, unless we have to use Web3, but ethers seems to be more dependable. And that's pretty much it for here. So there's lots of options for how to do this. There's other packages such as React Web3, which is I've used before. It's quite good. You can kind of figure out what works best for you. So once you have issues, what I found is if you just drop down to using this type of approach, makes it easier to manage working through issues. If you don't have any issues, then use another library. I'll give you some options. Okay, so like I said, MetaMask, then hooks, using hooks. Web3, which you can find here if you want to learn about that. I'd probably recommend going with ethers.js, which we're going to use for the rest of the series. And here's our project here. So if you clone the repository and then run yarn install, then yarn start, should be good to go. This should pop up. And then if you go to the test URL, this should come up. Okay, so right now we're using Web3, as you can see here. This is big enough. Get bigger. Bigger too. So with this, so if you just wanted a template, a plain template project, you can use the template somewhere here. You can just use this, and I'll give you a pretty clean template with most of the stuff that we have here, without any of the code that we use in the future series. I'm probably will update that later on so that it's using some of the advancements we come up with as we go further. Okay, so the structure of the application, just quickly, is we use these view components. So they basically are our top level components, and that's where we'll plug in our hooks. So here, this use injected Web3 is going to grab our Web3 from MetaMask, which I'll show you in a second. And then the next hook will wait for this to change the state, and it'll depend on that state to do the next thing you want to do. And then we'll keep doing that. So each hook will grab a dependency on our state, and it'll do something. So I'll have a video up around managing complex states and blockchain applications using React hooks in the video, not as part of this series, but just another video. So that should be up there now. So if you want to have a look at that, that'll explain this concept a bit more if it's not making sense right now. Okay, so let's go and have a look at this hook. Actually, before I do that, let me just show you a couple quick things. So the structured application essentially is we have this view component here that will connect to components. So right now we have, looks like just one here. So regular functional React components that will do something. And then this view component will usually include those here. So this is pretty simple. It's not doing anything yet, but normally that would be what happens. And then these components and the subcomponents that are nested within them will call actions. There's no real actions yet. but they would call actions here on this action component. This will generally push things to state in our store. So this is where our state is. So our state, application state, is defined here in our interface. So our interface says iapp states, which I don't like the I, but so here is our Ethereum address, which we're going to set in a second. Here's our Web3. This is the Web3.js object we're going to set. The actual balance for that account, this address, and then the injected provider that comes from MetaMask, and then we're going to have an ethers provider that we're going to put on this. So this will evolve and grow as we move along, and we'll have better typing as well as we go forward. Okay, so our store. So we call a dispatch method, which I'll show you in a second. That's going to call one of these to say, I am setting the address. That will fall into the reducer. So this is just the basic Redux style of applications. So once it gets here in this case statement, it will then set this particular part of our state with the payload it receives. Okay, so now going back to here. So we go to our first hook. So what this hook does is it's going to, let me just open the MetaMask API. Okay, here's the MetaMask API, the provider API. I think it's injected. So we're just going to check the window to see if we have this Ethereum object. And then we can use it. And then there's so this method we need to call Ethereum enable that asks the user whether they want to connect this application for privacy reasons. And after we have that, we can then ask for the accounts. Actually, can ask for the accounts on enable, or we can ask for it as a selected account, which we'll do. And then there's some send options for actually calling things. So we're actually going to use ethers or Web3 to do the actual calls. And this, the on. So when things change, which we'll do, we're notified of that and we can make that. So the good thing about doing this at a top level component is all of our other components can then assume that we have already set the state in the state, and they don't need to call this hook again. They just know in the state that they can get the ethers object and whatever else they might need, like the address. Okay, so going back to this hook. So it's basically just mimicking a lot of this just as a React hook. So see here, we're going to check. Okay, let me just explain this quickly. So here, when this runs, we have a dependency on window Ethereum, which we had in the documentation. And then whenever this changes, this use effect hook will run, and then we will call window provider. And window provider is asynchronous. So React's use effect hooks, they don't allow asynchronous calls yet. And there's a new API or a new part of React coming out called Concurrent Mode, which includes something called suspense. So that will allow you to do this in a different way. So if that comes out before the end of the series, we'll include that or maybe do an amendment when that comes out. But here you can see we'll check for this Ethereum object, just like we did before. And then we are going to set our provider with window Ethereum or the legacy style of current provider. And then we say provider.enable, that asks the user whether they want to connect to this. And once we get all that, we're going to dispatch this to the store and set this into our state. So we're going to set this injected provider there. And then if accounts change, like we showed before, we are then going to we're going to set that account onto our state. If the network changes, right now we're not going to do anything, but we probably will do something in the future. Okay, so what happens there? So now, at some point in the future, we are going to have the provider and the address set into the state. So now Web3 will go, and once we have an address set, this will run. So every time this changes, this is our dependency, it will run. So one thing to note is there's an issue here where the first time it runs, they call it a waterfall problem in React, that this may not be set. So even though it's our dependency and we're expecting it, the first time it runs, this will be null. So we just need to check if it's set, and then we call the asynchronous method. So here in the asynchronous method, we're then going to fetch the balance. So if we have our injected provider, we're then going to use Web3 and create the Web3 instance with that provider from MetaMask. Then we get the balance, and then we convert it from Way, which is 10 to the 18 power of what Ethereum is, and then we're going to turn it to an Ethereum value, and then we're going to set those two objects into our state. So let's just look at that quickly. There's Chrome. Okay, so if we go to localhost, we go to test. Okay, so the enable call is going to ask us if we want to connect. So we want to connect. Now we have an account. So here we have an account that we're using. If we just refresh, we'll see here we're using Web3. And if we change anything, you'll see network. Oh, we just saw network changed. It's going to switch pretty quick. You'll see there. And then if we change our account, there's only one account. Let me just create one quickly. So if we change our account, you'll see accounts changed. So that we're going to react to later on as well. And we'll get the screen to update. We'll tell components to update. But you'll see that's pretty elegant because of hooks. Okay, so the other thing we wanted to look at is with ethers. So with ethers.js, we're going to have a hook there. So it's exactly the same as the Web3 hook. And this one we'll be using going forward. The only difference is once we get the address, we're going to create our ethers object, or an ethers provider, and then he's going to get the balance, he or she is going to get the balance, and then do the same conversion and set those on. So the only difference here would be that we'd then call this hook instead. So this hook can stay the same, and if you have a different provider, a different way of getting a provider, you just have to change this hook, and the rest of your hooks can remain the same. So now this should say using ethers. Yep, so same thing. So we get a result using ethers, and the other functions will work the same. So account change, because that's coming from the top level hook, that injected Web3 hook. Okay, so the couple things just to keep in mind, a couple of notes to have. So one is that, so last weekend at the ETH Waterloo conference hackathon, we found that when we were using MetaMask plugins, that there is an issue there with having Web3 at all, installed at all in your application. So be a bit careful there. So if this is in the future, the API would look a little bit different or might be different. So we were calling it now, when we're using plugins with the newest builds of MetaMask, we were calling to get permissions this way. So just check your documentation. And if you follow along the series, whatever time you go to this, we'll have whatever is the most up-to-date way to get Web3 up here. But this is just something in the future to be aware of. The other thing to look at, so this is November 2019. I can just show you something quickly. Come up. Actually, here. Yeah, so one thing to be aware of with Brave right now, so Brave is injecting, let me pull up Brave. Yeah, so Brave is injecting over the MetaMask injected provider. So there's an issue here. So right now, if you're using Brave, or if your users are using Brave, we should probably detect that you're using Brave if this issue is not resolved. And what you need to do is you need to go in your Brave settings, and you need to disable the Brave wallet. So you disable Brave wallet, close Brave, come back, and everything should work as expected. Okay, so that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll talk a bit about injecting Loom. And then from that, when we have both Web3 and Loom injected, so Loom will be our sidechain, our plasma chain that we're going to use to whenever we're not using the main Ethereum network, we're going to use that chain to store state and manage tokens and things like that. So the next video we'll deal with use Loom hook, and then from that we'll have everything we need, our two connections, and then we'll start to build this out.